At 4:58 in the morning, a single Accord dropship came down on a dry lake bed in the Nevada high desert, and its scanners reported the safest possible landing zone on the entire planet. Flat ground, no structures, no population within 11 miles, no metal signature larger than a fence post. That was the first thing the scanners got wrong, and it would not be the last, because the flat white ground the ship was reading as empty desert was actually a seasonal lake with a memory, and in about 6 hours it was going to remember what it was. If you're enjoying stories like this, go ahead and hit that like button, and if you're not subscribed yet, consider it, because we're a small channel trying to hit our first 1,000, and every one of you actually moves the needle. Drop a comment and tell me the dumbest thing you've ever seen tourists do out in real desert country, because I promise you, by the end of this one, you're going to have a new favorite. All right. Let's go stand out on that dry lake at dawn, because the deadliest thing the Accord ever built is about to have the single worst day of its 400-year service record, and it isn't going to be anyone's fault but its own paperwork. The Verity Accord did not send armies to worlds it wanted to correct. It sent one machine. That was the entire doctrine, written by a species that had stopped fighting wars 300 years earlier and had never really stopped being proud of it. War, in Accord thinking, was a failure of precision. If you needed 1,000 soldiers to solve a problem, you had misunderstood the problem. So instead the Accord built enforcers, singular armored operatives, half-salvaged organic tissue and half-alloy frame, wired directly into a legal and tactical processing core that let one unit do the work of a battalion without ever needing to sleep, eat, or ask permission twice. There were only 9 of them in the entire Accord fleet. Draeth Vane was the oldest, and by a wide margin the most decorated. 211 confirmed apprehensions across 41 worlds, 0 unsuccessful deployments, 0 civilian mass casualties. A record so clean that junior officers studied his mission logs the way engineers study a bridge that never fell down. His directive on Earth was simple by Accord standards. A registered relay beacon on the planet's surface had gone dark 11 days earlier without an authorized shutdown code, which under Accord law constituted either sabotage or an unauthorized armed actor operating outside of any recognized government structure. Vane's assignment was to locate the responsible party, neutralize any threat, and restore the beacon or confirm its total loss. Nobody back on the flagship expected this to take more than a day. Vane had cleared entire fortified compounds alone in less time than that. Riding shotgun on the mission, several thousand miles up and several 100 million credits worth of processing power lighter than Vane himself, was analyst Prin Odell, 26 years old in Accord reckoning, freshly assigned, and cursed with the specific personality trait that made her read the entire sensor packet instead of just the summary line at the top. Prin had flagged 3 separate anomalies in the survey data before the dropship even left the hangar. Nobody on the bridge had wanted to hear about any of them. The flat ground reads as terrain, Prin said over the comm 20 minutes after touchdown, but the mineral composition is inconsistent with bedrock. It's evaporite, salts and clay. That specific signature only forms one way. Define the way, Vane said. His voice, when it came through the local speaker instead of the ship comm, had the flat comm of something that had said thousands of tactical briefings and never once raised its volume for any of them. It forms at the bottom of a lake, Prin said, after the lake leaves. Then there is no lake. There's no lake right now, Prin said carefully. I want to be precise about that distinction because I don't think the ground agrees with the tense you're using. Vane logged the objection, the way he logged all of Prin's objections, in a column of his working memory reserved for information that did not currently change the mission parameters. It was not that he disagreed with her. It was that Accord doctrine did not have a category for a battlefield that was only sometimes a battlefield. A structure was a structure. A road was a road. A dry lake was terrain, full stop, and terrain did not change its classification based on a season it wasn't currently in. That single blind spot, more than any weapon on the planet, was the thing that was actually going to beat him, and neither of them knew it yet. 6 miles east, in a town so small it didn't get its own dot on most maps, Ruth Calloway had already been up for 40 minutes. Everyone who mattered in Coyote Flat, Nevada, called her Rusty, on account of 31 years hauling freight through some of TH. The emptiest stretches of highway on the continent before her knees gave out and she traded the truck for a folding table, a CB radio, and a coffee pot that never fully turned off. Every morning at 5, 7 days a week, Rusty keyed up Channel 19 and ran what she called the Desert Dispatch. 4 minutes of conditions and warnings for anyone driving, hiking, or working the back country between 3 counties. It had started as a favor to her old trucking buddies. 11 years later, half the county set their alarms around it. "Morning, morning," Rusty said into the mic, her voice rough with coffee and low static. 61 degrees out at the flat right now, headed up past 104 by 2 this afternoon, so drink your water before you think you need it, not after. Wind's calm right now, but we've got a monsoon cell building down over the mountains to the south. And if that thing organizes the way the radar's hinting, we could see flash flooding in the washes by early afternoon. I want to say this part's slow for the new folks and the tourists renting off the highway. If you would not drive through 2 feet of moving water in your truck, do not walk into a dry wash just because it looks dry right now. It is not a road. It is a river taking a day off. She paused to sip her coffee. That's your dispatch. Be smart, watch your neighbors' trucks for you, and I will see everybody on the other side of this heat. She had just clicked off when Frank Delgado, who ran the gas station and diner that made up roughly 40% of the town's entire economy, burst through her screen door without knocking, which he'd been doing since 1994 and had no plans to stop. "Rusty," he said, "there's something on the flat." "There's always something on the flat, Frank. Coyotes, weather balloons, that one guy with the drone." "It's not a weather balloon." She looked out the window. 6 miles off, catching the first hard light of the sun, something the size of a 2-story building sat gleaming on the white lake bed like it had always been there. Vane's first hour on the ground would later be described, in his own after-action report, as tactically sound and operationally uneventful. He deployed 4 scout drones in a standard search pattern, established a secure perimeter around the dropship, and began triangulating the source of the dead beacon signal, which his instruments placed somewhere in the low hills north of the flat. Standard procedure called for a full environmental assessment before extended operations, and Vane ran one, and the results came back clean. Temperature acceptable. Radiation acceptable. No hostile fauna detected within immediate range. What his environmental package did not have a category for was the number 104, arriving at 2 in the afternoon, on an armored frame originally engineered for a temperate homeworld, and cooled by a liquid system designed around expectations that never included a dry lake bed acting as a natural reflector for solar heat. By 9 in the morning, his internal temperature sensors were already reporting numbers his systems had never needed to explain before. The ravens found him 40 minutes after that. Cout Flat's raven population had spent generations perfecting one very specific skill, which was locating anything shiny, edible, or interesting within a 15-mile radius and relieving whoever was holding it of the burden of continuing to hold it. They were, by any honest measure, smarter than they had any right to be, capable of remembering individual human faces for years, solving multi-step puzzles for a food reward, and teaching each other tricks that worked. A raven the regulars at Frank's diner had been calling ambassador for 6 years, on account of how confidently he strutted, found Vane's exposed drone charging station within the hour, and discovered that the little blinking indicator lights came off with a good hard yank of the beak. Analyst Prin watched the feed from orbit with an expression that, had she possessed a physical face on that particular monitor, would have been somewhere between horror and delight. "Enforcer," she said, "you are being disassembled by a bird." "It removed a status indicator," Vane said. "It is cosmetic." "It removed 4 status indicators in 6 minutes, and it is currently attempting a 5th. Log it as local wildlife interference and continue the search pattern." She logged it. She also, quietly, started a separate file that she was beginning to privately think of as the reasons this might not go the way the mission brief assumed. And by 9:30 that morning, the file already had 3 entries in it. Deputy Cora Vance, who worked county law enforcement out of an office that also handled dog licenses and burn permits, arrived at the edge of the flat a little before 10 with her citation book already out. Because in 11 years on this job, she had developed a very specific rule about anything large, unregistered, and parked on fee. Daryl Desert Land, and the rule was that it got a citation whether it had a face or not. She walked straight up to Vane, stopped at a distance most humans would have found too close for something 8 feet tall and built like a war memorial, and said, "Morning. This your vehicle?" "I am the operator of the craft behind me," Vane said. Great, you got a permit for off-highway operation on this parcel. This is a landing zone for an Accord enforcement action. That's not a permit, Cora said, writing. This is Bureau of Land Management ground, which means you need a use authorization before you set anything down that isn't foot traffic, and you're also sitting about 40 yards inside a posted desert tortoise habitat buffer, which is a separate violation with its own fine. I'm going to write you a warning today instead of a citation, because I've genuinely never had to write this one before, and I want to check with my supervisor on the wording. But I need this craft moved off the buffer zone by end of day, or it becomes a real citation, and those don't go away just because you're not from around here. Vane processed this in the same amount of time it had once taken him to process a hostile fortification's entire defensive grid. In 211 prior deployments, he had never once been issued a written warning by a uniformed but unarmed civilian official who appeared to consider a desert reptile's living space more urgent than an active military presence. His doctrine had a very clear category for armed resistance and a very clear category for civilian noncombatants who fled or hid. It did not have a category for a woman in a beige uniform politely explaining that he was in violation of a paperwork requirement. I do not require your authorization to operate, he said. Sure you do, Cora said, tearing off the warning and holding it out. Everybody does, that's kind of the whole point of it. He took the paper because he genuinely did not know what else to do with the moment, and Cora walked back to her truck, and behind her, 40 yards off, Ambassador the Raven successfully removed a sixth component from the drone charging station and carried it directly to the top of the dropship, where he began to examine it with the deep satisfaction of a professional. By 11, the beacon triangulation had narrowed the search to a set of low hills where a private ranch maintained a network of old ranching radio repeaters, one of which had, in fact, been the source of the dead signal, having simply lost power during a storm 11 days earlier because nobody had gotten around to swapping the battery. It was, in every meaningful sense, the least dramatic possible explanation for the entire mission, and Vane's doctrine had absolutely no framework for accepting that answer at face value, because Accord protocol assumed that a dead beacon meant hostile interference until directly disproven by physical inspection of the site. And physical inspection of the site meant crossing terrain his own analyst had already warned him about twice. The most direct route to the ranch runs through the wash system north of your position, Prin said. I'd recommend the ridge route instead. It's 20 minutes longer. The wash reads as dry terrain, Vane said. It is the efficient path. It reads as dry terrain right now, Prin said. I said this about the lake bed too. Noted, Vane said, and took the wash. Down in Coyote Flat, the storm cell Rusty had warned about that morning had spent the last 5 hours doing exactly what storm cells over that particular mountain range like to do, which was sit almost perfectly still over a single drainage basin and dump inch after inch of rain into ground too baked and too steep to absorb any of it. None of that rain had touched the town. None of it needed to. Water falling on a mountainside 11 miles away had one job after that, which was finding the lowest point available and getting there as fast as physics allowed. And the lowest point available ran directly through the exact dry wash that Vane's tactical assessment had just classified as safe, efficient terrain. Frank Delgado's nephew, a 19-year-old named Miguel who worked weekends at the diner and spent most of his free time flying a camera drone around the flats, because there was, in his own words, nothing else to do out here, had gotten close enough that morning to catch 2 full minutes of footage of Vane standing on the lake bed before Ambassador spotted the drone as a rival and chased it off in a genuinely impressive aerial pursuit that ended with Miguel's drone clipping a fence post and going down in the scrub. Miguel walked out to retrieve it, found it mostly intact, and in the process got close enough to overhear Rusty's dispatch replaying on his truck radio, the part about the wash and the moving water, and thought absolutely nothing of it, because everyone out here had heard some version of that warning roughly 4,000 times in their life. What he did not know, and what nobody in Coyote Flat knew yet, was that the Accord's translation matrix had been quietly recording every open radio transmission in a 15-mile radius since the moment the dropship landed, the way it recorded every transmission on every world out of habit, without anyone specifically ordering it to. Vane's escort of 2 scout drones entered the wash first, running low along the dry channel bed to clear the route ahead of him. The water arrived 9 minutes later, and it did not arrive as a wave, the way people who have never seen a flash flood always picture it. It arrived as a sound first, a low continuous roar rolling down out of the hills, and then as a wall of brown water and torn brush maybe 3 feet high, moving at a speed that made wading through it a physical impossibility for anything without a rocket engine. Both drones were swept 400 yards downstream in under a minute and deposited, badly damaged, in a stand of tamarisk brush that would take Vane the better part of an afternoon to locate. "Enforcer," Prin said, watching the feed cut to static, "your advance units are gone." "Define gone." "Define it yourself. I'm watching the water do it right now." Vane, standing at the mouth of the wash, watched several tons of moving water arrive out of a channel that had been bone dry 20 minutes earlier. And for the first time in the mission, his internal threat assessment flagged something as a genuine anomaly rather than an inconvenience. He stepped back from the edge, which technically counted as tactical retreat in his own log, and stood there running the same diagnostic loop 3 times, because his sensors kept insisting that the water had appeared without any local precipitation event, which was true, and which his doctrine had never been built to explain, because the doctrine that built him came from a world where weather happened where it fell and nowhere else. Ambassador, for his part, was not finished. Having exhausted the easy pickings on the drone charging station, he had moved on to the seams of Vane's own shoulder plating, where a loose access panel cover made an excellent object for testing exactly how hard a beak needed to work before something gave. 2 other ravens, recognizing a promising opportunity when they saw one, joined him within the hour, and by mid-morning there were 3 birds taking turns investigating an 8-foot armored enforcer with the calm, business-like patience of contractors assessing a job site. Vane's threat assessment logged each individual raven as a negligible biological presence, correctly, and entirely missed the fact that 3 negligible biological presences working in sequence over several hours were slowly and systematically removing every externally accessible fastener his frame had. The heat, meanwhile, had not let up. By early afternoon, his internal temperature was running high enough that his primary weapon system, an integrated 4-arm cannon that had ended 211 prior engagements without needing a second shot, began throttling its own output to avoid a thermal failure, a limitation his own engineers had installed specifically to prevent him from ever cooking himself alive on a homeworld that had never gotten anywhere near this hot. He didn't need the weapon. He hadn't fired it once. But its silent, automatic derating was the first small, honest signal that this planet was doing something to him that no fortified compound on 41 other worlds had ever managed. Back at the ranch that owned the dead repeater, the actual owner, a 70-year-old widow named Dot Havorson who had run cattle out here for 50 years, and did not much care what was walking around on her land as long as it left the fences alone, watched the whole retreat from her porch with a pair of binoculars and a level of concern roughly equivalent to watching a stray dog get chased off by a rooster. "He's a big one," she said to nobody in particular, and went back inside to finish her lunch. The storm cell that had flooded the wash was only the leading edge of a much larger system building over the mountains, the kind of afternoon monsoon buildup that this stretch of desert saw a dozen times every summer, and that every single person who had lived here more than a season had learned to read in the sky the way sailors read a horizon. Rusty caught sight of the anvil cloud stacking up to the south around 1 in the afternoon and keyed up an unscheduled bulletin on Channel 19, something she rarely did outside her regular morning slot. "Breaking from the regular schedule here, folks, but that cell over the Ruby Range just went vertical, and it is organizing fast. I'd expect gusty outflow winds within the hour, could be 40, 50 miles an hour when that thing's downdraft hits the flat, and it is going to kick up one heck of a dust event when it does, because that lake bed has been bone. Dry for going on 4 months. If you're out that way, get your vehicle facing away from it now, because visibility's going to drop to nothing in about the time it takes to say so." The Accord's translation matrix caught every word of it, rendered it faithfully, and delivered it directly to Prin's console, and Prin, reading it in full for the 2nd time that day, felt something that would have been dread if her species had built her to feel dread on quite that specific a frequency. "Enforcer," she said, "there is an outflow event inbound. Local reports describe it as a severe dust condition." The lakebed is flat and open. Dust is not a tactical concern. It was not a tactical concern for me either until roughly 9 minutes ago when I pulled the mineral composition on that lakebed dust and found out it's almost entirely dried alkali salt and fine clay. It's hygroscopic. Give it moisture and it doesn't behave like dust anymore. Define how it behaves. Like cement, Prin said. Wet cement. And that storm is not just bringing wind in Forcer, it's bringing rain behind it. The outflow hit 40 minutes later, and it hit exactly the way Rusty had described it. A wall of gusting wind racing ahead of the storm cell and lifting the entire dry lakebed into the air at once. A rolling brown-white curtain of fine alkali dust that reduced visibility across the flat to almost nothing inside of 90 seconds. Vane's optical sensors, engineered for the clean atmospheres and controlled environments of the worlds the Accord usually operated in, struggled immediately, switching between 3 separate imaging modes, trying to find one that could see through a suspension of mineral particulate this fine. His joints, his intake vents, his weapon housing, all of it began taking on a fine coating of dust that his systems, correctly, still classified as a minor and non-threatening contamination event. The same call his systems had made about the drones and the temperature and the water, each individually reasonable, each one a small accumulating debt that his doctrine had no line item for. And then the rain came in behind the dust, the way it always did on this side of the mountains, arriving in heavy scattered bursts rather than a steady soak, and every particle of that fine alkali dust that had settled into every seam and joint on Draeth Vane's armored frame did exactly what Prin had warned him it would do. It turned to paste, and the paste began to set. He noticed it first as resistance in his left knee actuator, then in the fingers of his weapon hand, then, with a mounting and genuinely novel alarm, in the primary hip joint that let him walk at all. By the time the worst of the squall passed, and the dust settled into a slick, drying slurry across the entire lakebed, Draeth Vane, the Verity Accord's most decorated enforcer, 211 confirmed apprehensions and 0 prior mission failures, was standing in the middle of a Nevada dry lake with both feet sunk to the ankle in rapidly hardening alkaline mud, unable to bend his left knee, and reporting, for the first time in 400 years of continuous service, a full mobility fault with no clear tactical solution. Enforcer, Prin said, and there was something in her voice now that was not quite professional detachment anymore. What is your status? I am experiencing localized joint failure, Vane said, consistent with environmental contamination. That's the 4th environmental contamination event today. It is. Sir, she used the honorific rarely, and only when she genuinely needed him to hear the next sentence as something other than routine telemetry. I don't think this planet has weather. I think it has a system, and I think every single piece of it that we logged as scenery this morning has been load-bearing the entire time. He didn't answer that, because for the first time all day, he genuinely did not have a doctrine-approved response ready, and the silence that followed was the longest one in the entire mission log. It was into that silence that the 5th problem of the day arrived, quieter than the rest, but in some ways the one that unsettled him most. Vane attempted to relay a full status report back to the flagship in orbit, standard procedure anytime a mission encountered a mobility fault, and found that his signal, which had carried clean and strong all morning, was returning nothing but a thin, broken stutter of static. Prin caught it from her end at the exact same moment and ran a diagnostic before he even had to ask. It's not your transmitter, she said. I'm reading a heavy magnetic anomaly under that entire basin. There's an iron and magnetite deposit running under the flat, deep enough that it never showed up on the geological pass, but strong enough to distort anything broadcasting through it at your current elevation. You've been sitting inside a dead zone since the moment you landed. The beacon signal reached the ship. He beacon sits on the ridge above the deposit. You're standing in the middle of it. She paused, and for the first time that day, her voice carried something closer to genuine unease than professional caution. Enforcer, that means the original distress trigger that sent you down here in the first place was never a hostile jamming signal. It was this basin, quietly eating half the transmissions that pass through it, the way it's apparently been doing to everyone who's ever tried to get a clean signal out from the bottom of this lake. It was, Vane understood slowly, the same shape of failure the entire day had been built from. Not a hidden weapon, not a fortified enemy, but a piece of ordinary ground that had been doing exactly what it always did, long before he arrived, indifferent to the fact that an entire Accord mission brief had been written around the assumption that emptiness meant nothing was there. Prin, watching the whole exchange from orbit, allowed herself something she would never have logged officially, which was a very quiet, very private moment of satisfaction. She had flagged the lake bed. She had flagged the wash. She had flagged the dust and the heat, and now, finally, the dead zone, and every single flag had been overruled in the moment and proven correct within the hour. It was not a good feeling exactly, watching an enforcer she genuinely respected get slowly dismantled by weather and birds. But there was something almost peaceful in finally being right about a thing loudly enough that it could no longer be filed and forgotten. Word travels fast in a town of 400 people with nothing else on the schedule that afternoon, and by the time the storm cell moved off to the east, leaving the flat steaming under a washed clean sky, a fairly substantial portion of Coyote Flat had made its way out to the edge of the lake bed in trucks, on quads, and in Dot Havorson's case, on a horse she had not ridden in 6 years but apparently still remembered how to sit. Nobody brought a weapon. Nobody had discussed a plan. They came the way people in a small desert town come to watch any large, strange, and genuinely interesting thing that has appeared on their horizon, with lawn chairs and coolers, and a general willingness to see how it turned out. What they found, standing in the middle of the drying flat under a sky full of wheeling ravens, was an 8-foot armored figure sunk calf-deep in hardening mud, one arm hanging useless where the joint had seized, its polished frame streaked gray-white with drying alkali paste, and a very confused, very battered scout drone dangling from Ambassador's beak 40 feet up as the Raven carried it home like a trophy. Cora Vance walked out onto the flat first, because it was, technically, still her jurisdiction, citation book already back out. "You didn't move it," she said, looking at the dropship still parked squarely inside the tortoise buffer. "I have been occupied," Vane said. "I can see that." She looked him up and down, taking in the mud, the seized joint, the general posture of something that had, for the first time in its existence, run entirely out of good options. "You want a hand." Vane processed the offer through every layer of doctrine he had, and every layer of doctrine returned the same answer, which was that an armed representative of a hostile or unknown political structure did not extend assistance to a lawful enforcement operative without an ulterior motive, and that accepting help under those conditions constituted an unacceptable tactical vulnerability. He looked at his own left leg, buried past the ankle in mud that was, according to his own sensors, now approaching the compressive strength of low-grade concrete, and understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with any of his training that the ulterior motive, if there was one, was considerably less pressing than the actual physical problem in front of him. "I would require a tow line and mechanical leverage," he said, "not manual assistance." "Didn't offer to carry you," Cora said, writing something new on her pad. "Offered to tow you. There's a difference, and it's the same difference between a favor and a rescue, so don't overthink it." She tore off a second sheet and held it out along with the first. "This one's for operating recovered equipment without inspection tags, by the way. I know you're having a day. I still have to write it. Ma'am doesn't get to skip county code just because there's a spaceship involved." "You are still writing citations." "Storm didn't cancel my job," Cora said. "Neither did you. Come Monday, I've still got a report to file, and it's going to say a registered enforcement craft landed in a protected buffer, got 2 written warnings, and got towed out of the mud by 3 pickup trucks and a horse. Nobody back where you're from is going to believe that report, but I'm writing it true because that's the job, too." "That we can do," Rusty said, stepping up Bess. Eyed Cora with the easy authority of someone who had spent 31 years getting 18-wheelers unstuck from places 18-wheelers had no business being. "Frank's got a tow chain on that truck of his rated for 6 tons. Question is whether you're rated for that kind of pull without your arm coming off with the rest of you." "My structural integrity exceeds 6 tons of applied force," Vane said. "Good," Rusty said. "Then let's get you out before that mud finishes deciding it likes you." It took 40 minutes, 3 trucks, a come-along, and a genuinely spirited debate between Frank and Dot Havorson about the correct angle to run the chain. But at 4:52 that afternoon, with about half the town of Coyote Flat standing around in lawn chairs offering advice, Draeth Vane's left leg came free of the drying lake bed with a sound like a boot pulling out of thick clay, and he stood, for the first time in several hours, on solid if unsteady ground. "Overseer," Prin said quietly, using his formal title for the first time all day. "For what it's worth, I logged everything. Every warning, every anomaly, starting with the mineral reading this morning. I'd like it noted in the record that this outcome was flagged in advance and overruled." "Note it," Vane said. He was quiet for a moment, watching the crowd of civilians who had just spent the better part of an hour helping the intruder on their land climb out of the mud he'd been trapped in by their own weather. "Note this as well. No weapon was fired, no structure was destroyed, no person on either side was harmed at any point in this operation. That wasn't the mission objective." "No," Vane said. "It was not. I am beginning to suspect the mission objective was never achievable the way it was written, because it assumed I was arriving to correct a threat, and there was no threat here. There was only a place that already knew exactly what it was, and I did not." Behind him, Miguel had finally coaxed his battered drone back into the air long enough to get a last few minutes of footage, most of which would end up online by that evening under a title nobody in Coyote Flat would ever be able to properly explain to the reporters who eventually called. Frank was already narrating the whole afternoon to a growing knot of regulars back at the diner, embellishing very little, because the true version was strange enough on its own. Dot Havorson had dismounted, handed her horse's reins to her ranch hand, and was standing with her arms crossed, watching the alien in front of her with the same flat, unimpressed patience she reserved for cattle that had gotten themselves stuck in a fence they'd walked through 100 times before. "You people always land in the worst spot," she said, not unkindly. "Had a hot air balloon do the same thing to my north pasture back in 09. Bent a fence, scared the cattle, took the fire department half a day to talk the fella down out of the mesquite. This isn't the strangest Tuesday this valley's had, if that helps any." It did not particularly help, but Vane logged the comment anyway, because by that point in the day he had learned that the small, offhand remarks from this town were usually the ones worth keeping. He turned to Rusty, who was coiling the tow chain back into Frank's truck bed with the unhurried efficiency of someone finishing an ordinary Tuesday. "You broadcast a warning about the wash," he said, "and the storm and the dust, all of it hours before any of it happened." "That's the job," Rusty said. "Every morning, same time, same channel. Been doing it 11 years. You had no reason to believe I would be listening." "Wasn't broadcasting for you," Rusty said, not unkindly. "Was broadcasting for whoever's out here that morning. Turned out that was you too. Desert doesn't really care who's tuned in. It does what it does either way. Best you can do is know it well enough to say so first." Vane looked past her, out at the flat, at the ravens still circling, at the drying mud already cracking into pale hexagonal plates in the last of the afternoon heat, and filed, in the section of his memory reserved for information that changed the mission parameters, a single new line. The environment was the operator, and everyone standing on this flat had known it since long before he landed. The dropship lifted off 2 hours later, mud-streaked and missing several exterior components that a persistent raven population would spend the following week proudly redistributing across half the county. Vane's official after-action report to the Verity Accord ran to 61 pages, and the summary line at the top, written in his own hand, read as follows. No hostile actor was located. The terrain itself constituted the entire operational resistance. Recommend this world be reclassified from low-priority correction target to environmental hazard zone, non-combat. The relay beacon, as it turned out, needed nothing more than a fresh battery, which D. Ott Havorson's ranch hand swapped out that same week using a part ordered from 3 counties over, the way he had planned to do before any of this started. The next morning at 5:20 exactly, Rusty Calloway keyed up Channel 19 same as she had every day for 11 years, coffee in one hand, the desert outside her window pale and quiet, and giving absolutely no sign that anything unusual had happened on it at all. Morning, 60 degrees at the flat should be a calmer day than yesterday, knock on wood. Storms cleared out east, so we're looking at clean skies and a more reasonable 98 for a high. Little bit of standing water still in the low washes from yesterday's flooding, so give that ground a day or two to firm back up before you go running quads through it. She paused, the way she always did, and allowed herself half a smile. And for the folks asking, yes, we did have some unexpected traffic on the flat yesterday. No, nobody got hurt, And yes, Ambassador the Raven is doing just fine and is, from what I hear, sitting on quite a collection this morning. That's your dispatch. Know your ground better than it knows you're watching, look out for your neighbors, and I'll see you all on the other side of the heat. If you made it all the way out here with me, do me a favor and drop a comment telling me which part got you, the citation, the ravens, or the mud, because I read every single one, and it genuinely helps this channel grow when you do. Thanks for writing this one out. I'll see you in the next story.